The ocean floor still holds traces of the transatlantic slave trade, but it also tells another story.
There were hundreds of slave rebellions, stories of uprising and uplifting. Everybody didn't just hang their head and come over.
You're talking about stories of resilience, and it wasn't possible for people to make these journeys unless you had a network of people who were striving to ensure the freedom of others.
The African Americans who were on the edges of the riverbanks realized what was happening, that this was their moment, that they should run, that they should take that one chance at freedom.
This was where she got the strength to do what men could not even think of doing.
The slaves had songs with hidden meanings, with double meanings, coded songs.
I know people on that wreck made it to freedom.
So we're talking about people of African descent arriving here to the wilderness of North America, the Western Hemisphere, and being enslaved. The Underground Railroad is part resistance movement, and it also represents the first human rights movement in this country. And as you could imagine, when people were enslaved, everyone didn't just accept that type of condition. On the left, you see an image of an uprising, an insurrection. And that was very, very common on plantations in the South as well as the North, because there was slavery in the North as well. And that was one way that people of African descent fought that system of slavery. And when I say resistance, I'm talking about everything from faking like you were sick, striving to poison enslavers, actually getting weapons and raising up an armed rebellion. You had all of those various different aspects of resistance movements that were going on in this country. Now, you look at the image to the right, that represents another aspect of that resistance movement. And that is what we come to know as the Underground Railroad. These were people who strived to escape plantations. And this panel kind of gives you a sense of some of the routes and journeys that people took from escaping, particularly in the South, in order to gain freedom in the North. One of the things that you'll notice is not every journey was from the South to the North. And that is oftentimes a myth that some people have about the Underground Railroad. They think that some people just went north. But the reality is people also went south. And as you can look on the image before you, you see routes of people going down into Florida. So you had people who sought freedom in these territories in Florida and were welcomed into those territories by the indigenous people there known as the Seminoles. And they had families with one another. Some of these freedom seekers even fought in the Seminole Wars. So you have people who are part indigenous and also of African descent. And many of us who come from the South have always heard stories about we had a great grandmother or a great aunt or a great uncle or a great great grandfather who was indigenous here. And there's a lot of truth to those type of stories. You also see some of those routes going down into Texas and into Mexico. And to this day, you have a population of people of African descent who live in Mexico who are known as Afro-Mexicans, who speak Spanish, who look just like me. And their ancestors got there through the Underground Railroad that was going south. Another thing that you notice is most of these journeys were traveled on land. You do see some of those journeys on waterways, but when this network first started to develop, most of these journeys were traveled on foot. But as it began to actually evolve, once you get into the early 1850s, you start to see other different mediums that freedom seekers used in order to access freedom. And that was the use of canals or waterways, as well as railroads. The map that you're looking at in New York State in 1855 gives you a sense of the way that those waterways or canals were used, as well as the railroads. By the time you get to 1855, you have the establishment of the New York Central Railroad. Now, prior to the 1850s, railroads were mostly local. So you would usually have to travel these journeys on foot until you got to more local locations where you might have the possibility of boarding a train. So for example, a person like Frederick Douglass would oftentimes take a steamship from Rochester along Lake Ontario and dock in the lower river here in the territory of Niagara Falls and catch a train into the interior city of Niagara Falls. And that was very common during that time. Now, the establishment of the New York Central Railroad was key to connecting those local railroads across the state and also into neighboring states such as Pennsylvania. So prior to the 1850s, as I mentioned, people wouldn't have the ability to board a train in New York City or in Philadelphia and ride it here into Niagara Falls. But after the New York Central Railroad was established, it gave people that type of opportunity to board trains and travel that train from a place like Albany or New York City or Philadelphia and ride that train all the way here into Western New York, particularly here in the city of Niagara Falls, because by 1855, Niagara Falls had the first suspension bridge that allowed people to cross over to the Canadian side.